Okay, so last time we left off talking about situations of diglossia around the world and how diglossia as a term refers to different functions that are ascribed to languages in multilingual and bilingual situations, and how sometimes certain languages are branded as the high varieties or the high languages, high in prestige, versus other languages are deemed as low in status or low in prestige, and the functions or domains where we'll find those languages all rely on what ideologies we give to the languages. So let's read this little exercise from our book. A diglossic situation. Use the concept of diglossia as a theoretical construct to consider classroom situations in which children who come to school speaking only a regional or social variety of the dominant language, which is well removed from the standard variety. So we're talking about a dominant language that has nothing to do with the standard variety that's taught in schools. So the dominant language, most children speak a version of this language. However, these children are exclusively taught in the standard language or in the standard variety. So assume that they are taught various uses of the standard, particularly its use in writing, and are constantly informed that the variety they bring with them is corrupt, bad, unacceptable, and so on. So consider issues of power, solidarity, and identity that could arise from this situation. So how do factors such as ethnicity, social class, and possibly even gender come into play? So what changes might you recommend language practices in schools? So even though this is a hypothetical scenario that we're talking about children that speak another language, another code, another dialect, they come into school and they're asked or they're expected to speak and learn this other variety that's super removed from them, that nobody's born and brought up speaking that way. So how could we build a bridge, an educational bridge that allows students to meet this dialect standard target, and also that helps them feel more positive about themselves, their identities, their language practices, the ones that they bring from their home? So how do we foster inclusivity and belonging in that classroom that is centered around a standard dialect that has nothing to do with them? How do we do it? How would you go about doing that? Well, this situation that we're discussing here is one that the United States faces. And it's also one that is found across places around the world, where usually there's a hegemonic norm, there is a standard language norm, and that language norm is removed from many of its people, or it's removed from the languages of the marginalized groups. So there are efforts in the United States by departments of African American studies, by departments of Latinx studies, to kind of decolonize education and to include different practices and different languages into the educational curriculum. So this would be a potential way of solving diglossic situations. Let's talk about Haiti, however. We were talking about Haiti last time we met. We briefly mentioned that in Haiti, they have a diglossic situation between French and Haitian Creole. So French is seen as a language that is prestigious, the one that is used in high variety domains, versus Creole is seen as a limiting language only for the household, won't give me the professional educational opportunities that I want. So, however, the majority of Haitians speak Haitian Creole, and French is a removed standard variety for the context of Haiti. So how would we go about bridging that language gap or that educational gap, and therefore allowing our students to acquire the standard with much more ease, and also in a way, also using discourses and building classroom materials that allow students to envision themselves and their backgrounds, their linguistic backgrounds, as equally important as the one that they're learning? How could we do that? Well, it all starts with education. It all starts in the classroom. And we could also make popular media discourses that include marginalized groups and their language practices. And that would be a way that we could combat these unequal dynamics of high variety and low variety. So in diglossic situations, a diglossic framework prescribes a language as belonging to a high variety group and another language as belonging to a low variety group. This works for situations where there is a standard variety, and this standard variety is used alongside a regional dialect. So they both coexist with one another, and they both have assigned functions, right? So a high variety tends to be a language that no one uses at home. You weren't brought up from birth using this language, versus a low variety, you were brought up from birth with this language. It's the language of the home, of intimate relations. So functions for these different ways of speaking and languages do not overlap because their status or their perceived status is different. So we won't find, for instance, a low variety language in a high variety situation, like in the legal courtroom, in a court case, or in school and education. In non-diglossic situations, however, many people learn the standard variety as their first language. So people have more equal access to the standard variety that is taught in schools. And it is possible that either language, the standard variety or the regional variety, or both languages could be used in a school, right? Or in a high variety situation. So for instance, maybe we can think about Spanish in Puerto Rico. Spanish in Puerto Rico, I said that some people argue that Puerto Rico could be seen as a case of diglossia. But I said that that's debatable, because even though English is prescribed a lot of prestigious status, and it's found in formal contexts, like we see it in education, in books, in science, in media, in business, Spanish has been awarded an equal status within our Puerto Rican community. We see Spanish in courtrooms and in legal affairs. We see Spanish in all public schools, right? So our community, our politicians, us as people, we've fought for an equally important, prestigious position for our vernacular language. So in this way, we have resisted US imperialism and, the efforts that were actually imposed on us during those first 50 years under US dominion, when we were a territory and not a commonwealth, right? So Puerto Rico is not a clear case of diglossia, even though English language is perceived as a language of an elite minority, and it does have prestige. Spanish is also found to have an equally prestigious status and functions. So let's go back to Haiti. So in situations of diglossia around the world, we see a lot of instances of linguistic and educational and social inequality on account of certain practices and certain groups being upheld as the standard, as the target, as what's prestigious and desirable, and other groups being marginalized. So in Haiti, they had a situation of diglossia until 1983. When Haitian Creole was recognized as a national language. This had many implications. Well, firstly, that we now perhaps see Haitian Creole as having more institutional backing, more support, more visibility in domains where perhaps it didn't have before. One of them being schools. However, this situation of giving Haitian Creole national language rights hasn't come without its resistance. For instance, many people still see and interpret French as a prestigious language. And many people would rather have schools be conducted in French rather than Haitian Creole. Why? Because there's this perception that Haitian Creole won't give people access to prestigious jobs, to employment opportunities, to life outside of Haiti. So there has been resistance to the adoption and the orthography and use of Haitian Creole, specifically as a medium of instruction in schools. Even though French is not widely used, it is still perceived within Haiti as the most prestigious language. So any attempt to legitimize the status of Creole or institutionalize it is resisted by a lot of people, specifically the elite minority. And that kind of makes sense, no? Because the elite minority, no le conviene, it's not convenient for them for other ways of speaking and other languages to be granted equal power, because then suddenly their language and their practices would be in competition with other ways of speaking that are actually more dominant within that country. So they see the officialization of written and spoken Creole in schools as limiting their access to French and consequently their social and economic mobility. And this is from the side of people who have lesser means and maybe they want to be more economically mobile. And they're like, well, I want to know French because French is a language that is attached to prestigious positions and jobs. And I want to be able to also have more opportunities maybe outside of Haiti, and Haitian Creole won't get me what I need, right? So diglossia reinforces social distinctions by asserting the social position and keeping people in their place. So it keeps people in their marginalized place, particularly those at the lower end of the social hierarchy. Joshua Fishman, who was a famous sociologist of language, provided his own definition of diglossia. He broadened the concept to specify that diglossia, or two languages in a multilingual or bilingual situation, are indicative of an enduring societal arrangement. What is meant by an enduring societal arrangement? Well, what it means is that in diglossic situations, usually they extend beyond a 3-generation period. So 3 generations, 3 families, the son of the son of the son, right? So this benchmark is important, is a good comparison, because if we were to consider other situations of bilingualism and multilingualism, for instance, the US, where certain ways of speaking are hailed as the most correct. English, everybody should learn English. It's the language of everything. And then, you know, bilingual and multilingual people are marginalized for speaking differently. So usually what tends to happen in this dynamic of different values and also different institutional support is that people that come into the US with different languages eventually lose ties with their heritage language, such that by the time that that person has established their own family and have children, their children are least likely to speak the heritage language or to have any ties at all. So by the time you reach 3rd generation, that Latino or that person from another background, Italian or whatever, doesn't speak the language that their family first came in speaking. Okay, so this situation is one that is known as, perhaps you can call it a situation of language shift, right? Of language change within generations. In a world of diglossia, this doesn't happen in a diglossic context. We have people that have more than one language. However, they use these languages in different parts of their life. You use this language for this purpose, this other language for this other purpose. So language shift would occur within 3 generations as languages compete for dominance in various domains. Questioning diglossia. Rarely do languages have such fixed societal functions. The relative status of language may not be exact. So for instance, let's take it back to the scenario of the role of English in Puerto Rico. Is it that predictable always? Or could we find educational cases where English is the norm? For instance, sometimes at the University of Puerto Rico, we have classes that are conducted in English, and then other classes are conducted in Spanish. So is it fair to say that English will only be found in the educational domain? Stepsois in 2012 argued that within Switzerland, Swiss German has long had high prestige that would contradict assumptions of Swiss German being seen as something low variety status. So Swiss German is now the language of instruction in elementary schools. So that kind of also adds to the perception of it being perhaps seen as high variety as well by the people of Switzerland. So not all situations are diglossic. Let's give another example. In Guadalupe, people engage in code switching of French and a French-based Creole. So it's a situation of stable bilingualism, right? So they have two languages that coexist with one another, and perhaps they are used in different domains interchangeably, and that's okay, that's normal. They are not necessarily in competition with each other. They don't necessarily have difference in values or ideologies. So diglossia only fits certain situations in the world. There are more examples of multilingual situations where we have languages in different domains being used variably than situations that are diglossic. So in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about code switching.